on the phone. It's a pleasure to welcome back to the program Huffington Post, Washington Bureau head honcho, Ryan Grimm. Hello, Ryan.
How you doing, Sam?
I'm doing well. It's I'm moving a little slow today for a Thursday. A little slower than I usually am on a Thursday, but aside from that, not so bad. Now, I haven't had a chance. I'm somewhat familiar with the Gary Webb story. I haven't had a chance to see either the documentary entitled "Freeway Crack in the System," directed by Mark Levin, or "Kill the Messenger," which is a biopic.
It's a Hollywood film, basically. Yes. Yeah, a little feature film.
But for those people who are not familiar with the story of Gary Webb, just give us some background on this, because I don't know how shocked people will be by the CIA drug running at this point. But I think the story that people, I think, forget is the complicity of the mainstream media at the time, the way that they rallied around in defense of the CIA.
Yeah, Gary Webb was he was really a kind of an old school investigative reporter, the kind that kind of comes up from and it doesn't happen this way anymore. But he started out as an investigative reporter at a small paper in Kentucky, which the kind of position that doesn't exist anymore. He went from there to a investigative job in Cook County, Illinois, at another paper, and then from there he went to San Jose. Kind of the path that radio DJs take, where they're trying to move up share across the country, and they'll uproot themselves, to get an extra couple points. And so he by 1996 he was at San Jose and had been doing investigative journalism. His entire career. He'd been nominated for several Pulitzers. He'd won 2 as part of a team, and he got a call from a source who was anonymous at the time, who I actually got to meet about a week ago, who said, "I saw a piece you did on asset forfeiture, which was way ahead of its time. For him to be writing on asset forfeiture back in the mid '90s." And she said, "I got an even better story for you." So my boyfriend is in prison for drug dealing, and he was working with the Contras and the CIA. And so that so he followed that tip and ended up breaking a huge story in '96, in the summer of '96. Now, what he did that had been different, because the AP had reported on this in the '80s. John Kerry had put out hundreds of pages worth of documentation about all this. What he did that was different is he had 2 specific Nicaraguan importers, and he had one specific a Los Angeles wholesaler named Freeway Rick Ross, and so he brought it onto the streets. What Kerry had done and what the AP had done is said, the Contras are involved in drug running.
Right.
And it was kind of an abstract idea, and also entirely believable. That's one of the biggest, businesses in Nicaragua at the time. And they had clandestine flights going down to Nicaragua. Why wouldn't somebody put drugs going back up? I mean, it's just, as a business decision, it's just what you would do, and obviously that happened. But what he did is he said these particular Nicaraguans, Norwin Meneses and Danilo Blandón. Norwin, by the way, his nickname was King of Drugs, and so the government.
That's not exactly the best moniker you want to have. Your nickname, if you want to keep it on the down low, right? I mean,
El Rey de Drogas. And subsequently, people said, well, but the Contras didn't know, and the CIA didn't know that he was involved with drug running. It's like, well, first of all, he had a long DEA file.
Now, wait a second. All right, so hold on.
Second of all, his name was the King of Drugs.
Well, let's. Yeah, but you could qualify that prescription drugs.
Right.
But wait a second. So let's just back up here for a moment because, I remember those hearings from Kerry, and I think, Kerry was pretty bold. I mean, that was something that was
He was great on that.
Very much to his credit back in those days.
And you're the only one giving him. No one else was. There was no political upside to that.
No, there wasn't at all. It was a very bold thing for him to do at that time, and. But what was specifically the information that was out there? Just that not just that the Contras were running drugs because that was a way to fund, but was it clear what the CIA's role was, and if so, what was that role prior to Gary Webb's series?
So one of the problems is that it depends on what you mean by the CIA. The CIA typically operates by contracting out to agents, so they will have an asset. Felix Rodriguez, for instance, the Cuban exile who has been involved in everything from the Bay of Pigs to killing Che to then running the Contras supply operation. So is he CIA? Well, absolutely. He's paid by the CIA, and he takes orders from the CIA. Enrique Bermudez was Gary Webb eventually tied directly to Meneses and Blandón. He was paid and recruited by the CIA. He did not show up for work in Langley,
right?
And flash his CIA badge and live out in suburban Virginia. So were there people that lived in suburban Virginia and walked out to Langley and with their ID badge and who knew what Enrique Bermudez was doing? That's a different kind of question. What Kerry did find is that the CIA regularly got reports of Contra drug trafficking and never did anything about it. And in fact, the CIA in 81 or 82 managed to change the regulations on reporting drug trafficking. So just as they were ramping up with it used to be the case that if the CIA got information that somebody it knew or was involved with was running drugs, they had to alert the DEA, FBI, other folks like that. They got that law changed, and subsequently, Kerry found that they did not alert any authorities. So it is a fact that they received many tips, quite credible ones, about drug running from the Contras, who were the CIA's army, and did nothing about it.
And we should be clear that when we're talking about drug running, we're obviously in trafficking. We're talking about bringing drugs into this country.
Right. Exactly.
And so, did Gary Webb essentially flesh out just how involved and how much awareness there was with the CIA? It's one thing to say, "Hey, we're funding this group that is also engaged in criminal activity." It's another to say, "We're not only funding this group that's engaged in criminal activity, we're actually giving them services in kind to engage in that activity."
And no, he didn't. And so, one thing that the media and the CIA beat him up for was he routinely would refer to the Contras as the CIA's army, which in fact they were. The CIA founded and funded the Contras. They would not exist if not for the CIA. And so Gary basically took the Contras as a proxy for the CIA, and he did not spend a ton of time investigating what particular people in Langley, knew about what its employees down in Nicaragua were doing. What he added to the conversation was that these particular Contras were bringing drugs to Los Angeles to this particular dealer who had been called the Walmart of crack cocaine. And so what it did is it tied what was an abstract idea that the Contras were shipping drugs into the U.S. to a particular, to the explosion of crack cocaine. And that's what the CIA and the media pushed back against. Their argument, if you would boil it down, would be like, okay, sure, some Contra folks were trading, we're bringing drugs into the country, but you can't blame the explosion of crack cocaine on this. It would have happened anyway, and these guys were keeping a lot of the profits, and there were lots of people involved with bringing coke into the country, and all that can be true. What Webb was saying is that what did happen is that at the early stages of the crack boom, the Contras, these two particular Contras, were bringing drugs in.
And the amazing thing about this story is how complicit, and not just how complicit, but how easily complicit the rest of the media seemed to be. There was recently a declassified piece coming out of, I guess, a declassified report coming out of the CIA entitled "Managing a Nightmare: CIA Public Affairs in the Drug Conspiracy Story." And, well, before we get to that, actually, tell us that what happened. So Gary Webb puts produces this series, writes this series, it's published. Then what happens?
So in short, this was mostly before the internet. I mean, this was San Jose Mercury News, so they actually put all the documents up online because they knew it was such an inflammatory charge. But there were fewer people online in '96. However, enough were so people were emailing it around and reading it. It really took off though when Black Talk Radio started hitting on it. Which is still a powerful political network in the United States, and not one that is often thought about or talked about inside the Beltway, but it's a powerful force, and it picked up Gary Webb's series, and it grew from there. And for the first couple of weeks, it received an extremely sympathetic reception, and then the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the L.A. Times, even the Nation magazine, collectively came together to attack the series and to pick it apart. They had L.A. Times had a team called the Get Gary Webb team of like 19 reporters charged with undermining
Literally?
his story. Yeah. I mean that informally they called themselves the Get Gary Webb team.
Wow. And what do we have a sense
of
their
mission? They said was to deprive him of a Pulitzer. That was how they kind of self-defined their mission.
So what motivated all of these different publications? I mean, were those guys? Was the Get Gary Webb team at the L.A. Times really just like, we don't want to be upstaged? How much of it was we don't want to be upstaged? What were the different motivations involved here? We don't want to be upstaged by some guy from the San Jose Mercury News,
right?
Or is it also there was just strategically placed reinforcement throughout the sort of the media, and then just the herd just stampeded?
Yeah. So all of them had some motivation of jealousy and who's this guy from San Jose that's going to show us up, and that was strongest with the L.A. Times. How did you miss this story in L.A. and get scooped? And they had even previously profiled Rick Ross and called him the biggest dealer and the man most responsible for crack's explosion across the country than anybody else. And then when they came back to take him down, they were like, oh, Rick Ross, he was just a corner dealer. Like, what? 3 years ago when you profiled him, here's what you said about him. The Washington Post, they had an establishment issue. Walter Pincus led their coverage. He's extremely tight with the CIA, even was kind of worked for a CIA front group in the 60s or whatever it was before becoming a journalist. And that close connection enabled him to do some of the best reporting around weapons of mass destruction. He was really skeptical of that in 2003, but he was the leading voice in the Post newsroom, and he actually won an internal debate with Douglas Farrar, who was the Central American correspondent and had confirmed a lot of what Gary Webb found. but he told me that Pincus beat him in an argument, and Pincus confirmed as much. Pincus said, "Look, my sources were telling me that this wasn't true." His sources are CIA. New York Times, very similar. It was in a similar position. They don't want to be beaten by San Jose Mercury News either, but also they're very tight with the national security apparatus. That's where a lot of their sources are. And Gary Webb, in a lot of his interviews after the story came out, pushed his reporting really further than it was justified, and so he kind of set himself up. I think they would have wiped him out no matter what. But amid the reaction to the story, he kind of fed into people who wanted to take the story further than it went, to say that the CIA did it on purpose and wanted to destroy the black community, or things like that couldn't be backed up by the reporting.
What
so they were?
Have you gone back? Has anybody? I'm curious about the Nation, for instance. I mean, because that the Washington Post. Obviously, there's people there, well-placed people there, who have relationships, sources, et cetera, and there's that dynamic of beat sweetening and all that. But I'm curious as to what the dynamic is at a place like the Nation. Is it just a way of saying? I mean, I wonder how much it was both a sense of like, well, we need to be taken seriously, so we've got to join in on this. We got to jump on this pig pile, and I wonder also how much it had to do with, it being the era of Bill Clinton.
So the Nation was driven by David Korn, and I think he'd be happy to talk about it. I think that'd be an interesting interview, to get him to reflect on it. Looking back, he did an excellent job of covering it in the late '80s, when John Kerry was looking into it. He did some of the best reporting, so he was very familiar with it. When Webb broke it 6-7 years later, and I've talked to him about this. He felt like Webb, went too far. Took his conclusions further than his reporting could justify. But I'd be curious what he thinks now that the documentary's coming out and the movie's coming out. And although one critical thing I didn't mention in the last answer was the weight that the papers gave to the reaction of the black community. I think it's hard for us to remember right now what the climate was like in white America back in 1996. This was a couple years after the LA riots. This was shortly after the white opinion riot that followed the O.J. Simpson verdict. Crime was still pretty high. Drug war was in full effect, and you had a kind of racial tension and, quote, fear of a black planet, unquote, that doesn't really exist today. And the Washington Post, in its editorial, one of its editorials about it, even had a line that said something like, more shocking than the allegations Webb made are the black community's response to them. And so, there was a sense among the papers that they had to dismantle the Webb story to reduce the anger in the black community. So that you can't really talk about this whole story without bringing that dynamic into play.
Interesting. And so let's get to that recently declassified memo, Managing a Nightmare, CIA Public Affairs and the Drug Conspiracy Story. This is basically the CIA looking sort of contemporaneously. Was it a contemporaneous account of what the implications of this Gary Webb story could be and what they were going to do about it, and then how shocked they were that they were that effective?
Yes, that's right. They said, we built up some good relationships with those in the media, and wow, this just really paid off. Man, yeah. I mean, you could, Putin could never hope to orchestrate something like the response to this story in a top-down way. No, because people don't believe them either. The 1960s Pravda is not as credible as the combined weight of the free press. The New York Times, the L.A. Times, the Washington Post. So they couldn't have asked for anything more. On the other hand, in some major ways, they kind of lost the war. I think if you ask most people, although if you ask most people who controls the House of Representatives, they don't know. But if you ask them, was the CIA involved in some drug running in the 1980s when it's the South American wars, I think most people would say yes.
Yeah, I wonder though. I mean, I don't know if that's the war really for them, right? I mean, I think it's
no, you're right.
You look back on it, and it's just like history, and it doesn't.
Right.
I mean,
yeah.
I mean, I wonder to what extent. I mean, it's obviously harder today because of the nature of our media landscape. I mean, much harder. But when you go back and you think that, like, it wasn't this. This is a relatively new phenomenon. There was no Huffington Post in 2003.
Right.
There was no nothing outside of basically what was around in '96, and so. When you see, it's hard for me to imagine that they just went like, holy cow, and I'm speaking to the CIA, holy cow, we really pulled that off. That's shocking. And they didn't say like, this is going to be the model that we use in the future. And maybe for things like, hey, how can we get an invasion of Iraq if we're told that's what we need to gin up? I mean, I wonder, my sense is probably that this is less effective, but I would imagine to a certain extent, this dynamic is still very much in place.
Sure, although the CIA was
and I don't want you to have to threaten any relationships you have with the CIA, Ryan.
Right. They didn't love my last couple pieces, but that's okay. But then, like I said, CIA was not. They didn't want to go to war in Iraq, so that's a slightly different story. But yeah, I think it. But then again, it's kind of PR 101. It just worked extremely well. They built close relationships with people, and when it was needed, the people were there, and they barely had to call in a favor because, like, for the reasons we laid out, they had their own. The media had their own motivations for going after him.
And so ultimately, what became of Gary Webb?
It's such a tragic story. His editor, who is now he's a dean of, I think, the LSU journalism school. His editor wrote a piece that he said was not a retraction. It was, and it didn't refute any of the facts, but it was very self-critical about. They had a logo on it that had the picture of the CIA. It was, so he wrote this kind of self-critical column, and the media, like the New York Times, put that on the front page, and he was given awards, and the narrative formed that the editor of the piece or the editor of the paper had backed away from the story. He was sent out to some dustbin bureau, filed a grievance, and left the Mercury News and went to go work for an alt-weekly. He went from an alt-weekly to doing investigations for the California State Senate. He had long battled issues with depression, and what I was told towards the end of his life, he couldn't afford. He lost his job, couldn't afford medication, and then he died of what people say was, and I believe was a suicide in 2004. A lot of the people that are close to the story don't they think he was killed. I think that they didn't need to. Nobody needed to kill him at that point because they had sufficiently destroyed him professionally. So that was 2004, and it's a shame that he's not around to see kind of the resurrection of his work now.
Do you get the sense that within sort of journalistic circles, there's been a change in perception, or
I do. People from the Post and the Times have written to me recently, and other significant folks in the media saying it's just horrible what was done to him. Jesse Katz, who was the guy who led the assault for the LA Times, has since apologized and said that he regrets it more than anything he's done in his journalistic career.
Wow.
I think that the media is embarrassed at how they were able to find dozens of reporters to sick on trying to discredit line by line this guy's series, instead of taking it and trying to advance the story. Like there was no integrity with how the media handled it.
Well, fascinating stuff. Ryan Grimm, thanks for updating us. People can check out Ryan's piece on the Huffington Post. We will link to that at majority.fm. The documentary, which is out, is Freeway Cracking the System, and the major motion picture, Kill the Messenger, is in a theater near you, I guess. I never get out to theaters, so I have no idea. But I presume it is. Ryan, always a pleasure. Thanks, man.
You got it.